Well, I don't know about the leaking bit. Depends on who you talk to. I'm simply saying that based upon my sources in the Department of Defense, people who are close to the senior military leadership tell me that they have made it very clear that choosing to fight Russia in Ukraine would be a serious mistake and should be avoided. That's what they've said. And I think they're being honest about that. And I think they're being truthful for a change. The second part is, are we capable of fighting? Well, of course, we're capable of fighting. The real question is, if you're going to fight, will you win? And this is the question that people don't ask enough. Goes back to an old strategic axiom: measure what you might gain by what you might lose. A collision with Russia would be a loss for us. There's nothing to be gained by it. The Russians have nothing that we need or want. There's no ideological hostility. We're not competing for power or control over any particular region. Russia's dispute is exclusively with Ukraine. We're a large part of the reason why the dispute exists. There's no question about that. But we can end that tomorrow morning if we decide to, by simply saying, we fought long enough. Russia has the upper hand. Zelensky, sit down, shut up, and take notes. We must have a ceasefire, but first we have to agree to negotiations without preconditions.
Does Washington want to fight Russia via a proxy war?
I think they did. I think they regret it at this point, to be blunt with you. No one will admit it publicly, but if you go back to the donor conference where Lloyd Austin spoke to the gathered donors from NATO and other nations and said, we have a very short time left, a very short window of time in which to make things happen. And time is running out. I mean, I quoted him in the op-ed piece for that reason. He knows, everyone in Washington in a position of authority now knows, Ukraine is losing. Ukrainian resistance is crumbling. The state itself is in danger of going out of existence. That's how bad it is. So the theory is, well, if we can give them anything within the next 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 days, perhaps we can rescue them from disaster. I don't see much evidence for that, but I think that's the theory.
Can Ukraine survive as a country if Putin pursues this war all out, whether for military reasons or for domestic Russian political reasons?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind, and this is something of which I was not aware until I consulted with a friend who's done some excellent demographic analysis. And he points out that at the beginning of this war, there were, at least in theory, 37.5 million Ukrainians in Ukraine. And he makes the point that today that's not the case. There were already 2 million Ukrainians working in either Great Britain or the European Union outside of the country. You now have 4 million Ukrainian citizens, albeit Russians, people who speak Russian, living under Russian occupation or administration right now in the provinces in the south. Then you have over 10 million Ukrainians that have fled the country.
10 million?
10 million.
That's a third of the country, or a quarter of the country.
Yeah, you've got 1 million that have gone into Russia and the rest that have headed west. Now, to this must be added the losses. And again, no one is telling us the truth in the West about the horrific losses that Ukraine has taken. You've heard me say about 157,000 dead on the battlefield. That includes 35,000 missing in action, presumed dead. And I've talked about a total of almost 400,000 casualties, people that are wounded. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, more than half of those will never return to duty because the wounds are too horrific. In other words, they're permanently lost to the Ukrainian fight. Now, supposedly when Zelensky was in town speaking to Secretary Austin and General Milley, several people have insisted that he actually told them that 257,000 Ukrainians have died. That includes soldiers, in other words, those in uniform, civilians, all types, all kinds, 257,000. Well, we don't know. I mean, that's an unconfirmed rumor. But what it does tell you is that today in Ukraine, there are roughly between 18 and 22 million people left in the country under Zelensky's control. Now, Judge, that number is roughly the same as the number of people living in the Netherlands. You cannot sustain this war with that small population. Judge, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
Okay. Apologies.
That's okay.
For watching and listening. Sometimes I'm all thumbs. I want to play a clip from Jack Devine. This is a guy that our audience loves to hate. He is, however, career CIA, and for many years was in charge of American espionage in Russia and monitoring Russian espionage here. Here's Jack Devine betting on a Ukraine win.
I'm betting on the Ukrainians still. It's not to say that the Russians aren't going to be formidable. I do think there will be undertrained. There'll be sometimes when you create something big and it's not well trained, they become cannon fodder. So I think it's going to be a really tough spring, and I think the war in many ways will be decided. There won't be a victor. In other words, the Russians cannot conquer Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not going to beat the Russians. There's a certain point where both sides pull back. Even if you don't have an agreement, they lower their intensity. And that's what I think Putin personally is in trouble in his own country, and I think he goes. That's why the stakes are so big.
So he's suggesting that this will be over when both sides lower their intensity, and if Putin does that, quote, he goes, because that will not be interpreted as a victory for the Russian nationalists. Your comments on that, Colonel?
Well, remember, the CIA has been telling us lies almost from the very beginning about everything happening in Russia.
Well, when Mike Pompeo was running the CIA, he publicly acknowledged that's their job, to lie to us. So how do you know whether to believe them or not?
Well, they do a very good job of lying. The problem is they're lying to Americans, and this man, Devine, knows absolutely nothing about Russians. I don't care what his job was, or about Ukrainians or the Slavic peoples that occupy Eastern Europe. The Russians are winning. Ukraine is crumbling. Ukraine's on the verge of collapse. We're going to watch that happen over the next several weeks. The Russians will crush out of existence what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces, and I think they'll have to go after this regime, assuming Zelensky and his friends don't rapidly flee the country to Poland or somewhere else. Now, having said that, the Russians are being very methodical, very deliberate. They are moving constantly, but they are not moving on multiple axes simultaneously. In other words, you're not going to see the blitzkrieg. What you're going to see on several axes are what I would call large meat grinders that are just systematically plowing forward, annihilating everything that they come in touch with that is Ukrainian until the Ukrainians are finished. There is no incentive for them at this point to negotiate with us unless we go in without conditions. Would the Russians prefer not to annihilate everything in Ukraine? Yes. They never went in there with that goal to begin with. But you can't walk in there and say, well, the only way we'll talk to you is if you withdraw all your forces from Ukraine and Crimea. That's absurd.
So really what you're saying is there's no way that Ukraine, and I'm paraphrasing you from the column, which I mentioned earlier, there's no way Ukraine can survive this war as an intact country.
Listen, I just told you what the demographics say. And what's even worse is that Ukraine has the lowest birth rate in Europe.
Oh.
So in addition to having lost millions of people because frankly, people like Devine and his masters have decided to wage this war on the backs of Ukraine. Ukraine is destroyed. I don't know what survives of it. I have no idea what will happen.
Even though I am your friend and admirer, and at times your student, let me raise your blood pressure one more time with Jack Devine on a weakened Russia.
Do we want a strong Russia with Putin and Xi? Is that going to bring us peace and harmony so we can live in isolation? I think Putin, the day he crossed, I'm on record in the Washington Post, in March last year, a few days after he invaded, he sowed the seed of his own demise. That is actually good news for us. Whoever causes it, that's a good news. A weak Russia that sees Putin going weakens China as well as Russia.
Does that make sense to you?
Again, I think the man's delusional. Putin has never been stronger than he is today. The Russian people have never been more united than they are today. Only someone who's never spent any time in the country and doesn't know anybody over there would make such preposterous statements. This is part of the larger false narrative. Look, he reminds me of some of the Germans that stood around in Berlin in 1945 and asked, what about the inevitable victory? What's wrong? What's happened? Because the regime over the previous 6 to 12 months had lied so consistently and effectively that the Germans were surprised to see Russian and American troops on the outskirts of the city. I think all I can tell you is that no, he's dead wrong. Now let's talk about this weakened Russia business. It's not weakened. The IMF has now stepped forward and talked about growth in Russia dramatically improving. Their exports are way up. None of this nonsense that we anticipated that was bad has happened to Russia. Russia's in a very strong and healthy position. We, on the other hand, our growth is declining, and it's not going to get better in the near term. Secondly, Russia is a state with an important role in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. If Russia were to be destroyed, which is not going to happen, if it were to weaken, it would open up opportunities for all sorts of potentially malicious actors to intervene. First of all, Eastern Siberia is not of much interest to the Chinese, contrary to popular belief, but it's very interesting to Japan and Korea. And the Japanese and the Koreans view Eastern Siberia as their territory because up until about 300 years ago, Mongols, Turkic peoples, Tartars, they were the only people in the region, and they're brothers of the Manchus, Mongols, and Japanese and Koreans. So do you really want Russia to collapse in Eastern Siberia? I don't think so. You go into Central Asia, Russia is a stabilizing factor there. In fact, Xi depends upon Russia to help stabilize it because the people in Central Asia have much more confidence and trust in the Russians than they do in the Chinese.
How unified is NATO behind Washington? I'm going to play a clip. Yeah, right. I'm going to play a clip for you in a minute from the president of Croatia. It's not Germany. It's not France. It's Croatia. But the language is very strident, and the criticisms of the West are very strong and articulate. Take a listen.
Ali ja nisam predsjednik Ukrajine.
Ako se Ukrajina želi braniti, treba li joj pomoći?
Razdragani pacifisti u cvjetnim haljenicama odjednom bi se napili krvi nekome, ali ne oni, nego preko tuđe grbače. Ovo je u određenoj mjeri duboko nemoralno što radimo kao kolektivni zapad koji u biti ne postoji, jer tu nema rješenja. Rješenje nije promjena vlasti u Rusiji. Dapače, njemački tenkovi u Harkovu će dodatno homogenizirati Ruse. Politički će ih homogenizirati. Zbližit će ih sa Kinezima. To se događa.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. The West is not united. You've been saying that. The tanks coming from Germany, he didn't mention the American tanks. The tanks coming from Germany will only gin up the Russians to fight more aggressively. It's in nobody's interest to weaken Russia. And he's a member of NATO.
Of course. Two things. Nassim Taleb often talks about finance, and he talks about people at the top who don't have skin in the game. Our problem in Washington, D.C., and in many capitals in Europe right now is that they're perfectly happy to fight this war until Ukraine ceases to exist, and 1 million Ukrainians are dead because they have no skin in the game. They haven't put themselves at risk, nor will they do so. And that's disgraceful, and he's talking about that to some extent. And then secondly, it's interesting this man is a Croat because, the Croatians, like most Europeans, to be perfectly blunt, that people don't like to admit, were part of the crusade to destroy Bolshevism during World War II. But he knows that Russia is not a communist state. He knows Russia does not aspire to conquer Europe. The Russians learned the hard way that imperialism is a very bad form of government and business. When you move into countries that are not yours and you have to govern and sustain people that are not yours, inevitably there's bad blood, there's anger, there's corruption. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who probably more than anyone else inspires the Russians who are at the top today, made it very clear we should all be grateful that this horrible empire that existed is gone. We don't want to govern other people. We want to govern ourselves. We want our own country, this place called Russia. And that is the way the Russians think right now. They're not interested in conquering anything, but we are making it impossible for them to turn away because we make threat after threat after threat to dismember the country, to destroy its regime. And we keep talking about it as though this is something the Russians want. They do not want that.
After decades of German political leaders disarming Germany and depriving Berlin of its credibility. I'm quoting your article. Chancellor Scholz decides to send tanks. Is this to please Joe Biden? Because he's not going to please anybody his domestic political forces, is he?
He'll please some people in Germany, a minority, I would suspect. The majority, I think, are somewhat horrified because the Germans, based on their experience, and they also know their own history, know that when Berlin and Moscow have cooperated and done business together, there has been peace in Europe. You know, if there's any one war in human history that made absolutely no sense, it was the war between Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany. They had been close allies and friends for hundreds of years. There was no reason for that to happen. It did. The Second World War, we know the background on that. It was a huge tragedy. Everyone decided in 1945, who was German, this will not happen again. We will not permit it. I cannot imagine Chancellor Kohl or Chancellor Schmidt, Helmut Schmidt, that some of your viewers may remember, standing up and urging equipment be sent to this corrupt gangster regime in Kiev that's killing off its own people with these stupid instructions that are given to their generals in the field with a military structure that is corrupt and celebrating it. On the contrary, I think they would have said absolutely not, out of the question. This man, Scholz, is not going to last long. And if anything, what we're seeing now, even though it is not patently obvious, is the beginning of the end of NATO.
So, Colonel, big picture, here's my head scratcher. If the West, if the leading countries economically in NATO, the United States, Germany, Great Britain, France, want to wage this war against Russia, if Tony Blinken and his globalist buddies in the foreign ministries in Western Europe really think that they can use the war to push Putin out or weaken him, if Jack Devine and the CIA, or if Jack is actually articulating what the CIA is trying to accomplish, why is the Western military response so tepid? I mean, you can't fight the Russians with just a half dozen tanks. And you can't fight them at all with tanks that aren't going to get there for another 4 or 5 or 6 months. And American troops in Poland are not going to keep Putin up at night.
We have 100,000 troops in Europe. And of that number, I'd be surprised if we have 40 or 50,000 combat troops. That means the soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains who actually go in and shoot people. In other words, most of that is still support. And we don't have that much artillery. We don't have that much in the way of immediate indirect fire support. We're in no position to do it. We could bring in more Poles. They can bring in a couple of 100,000 Poles to fight, but they're not going to be adequately armed to take on the Russians, and they're not going to be adequately trained. So it's sheer lunacy. But again, you've got to go back and understand how this began. At the beginning, Putin sent in a very small force and gave them very specific instructions that they were not to kill civilians, they were not to damage infrastructure, because he was simply trying to demonstrate the seriousness with which Russia viewed what we were doing in eastern Ukraine by building up this dangerous force against them. Well, it took 2-3 months. He finally figured out no one is going to negotiate with us. No one cares to. In the meantime, we reached the erroneous conclusion that, see, look, the Russians are weak. The Russians can't cope. The Russians are no threat. We can beat them. Well, that was the wrong conclusion. And what we're seeing happen right now is a massive expansion of Russian military power on a scale that we have not seen since the Cold War. And this is going to be a permanent expansion, a large and powerful force. The 700,000 plus that are around Ukraine right now are a brand new force, a brand new army. This thing is poised to do one thing: annihilate whatever is in its path. It will do that. However, again, the Russians are being methodical. They're being cautious because they do worry that we are led by impulsive, erratic personalities in Washington. And that stupidly, when we realize that the place is falling apart, I mean Ukraine, someone will say, well, we have to do something. I don't know how many times while I was on active duty, I heard people at the top of the political structure say, well, we have to do something. As soon as they say that,
right,
leave the room.
Right.
Get the hell out of there.
I mean, this is a favorite government line. They have to give the impression to the public that they're doing something, even if it's 180 degrees from what they're doing. But the West, whether it's Chancellor Scholz or President Biden, or to a lesser extent, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, is like a boxer punching with his left hand and then apologizing to the gallery with his right for hitting too hard. What are they accomplishing?
Scholz is doing what he's done throughout his career. Remember that Scholz and others have grown up over the last 30 or 40 years in this environment where there was very little change. And their formative period of experience came after the Cold War ended. And they saw a very different world. And they became, I think, enamored of this notion that the United States is the hegemon of the world, and that whatever we do is right, and anybody who resists us is morally wrong. They've taken this position, and this justifies all sorts of dangerous behavior. I don't think that Mr. Scholz is going to last much longer. I certainly don't think his foreign minister will. These people are out of touch with reality. No competent German statesman over the last 300 or 400 years would have made the stupid remarks and statements that they have.
Didn't he just lose his defense minister about 2 weeks ago?
Well, we haven't had much of it in the way of defense ministers in that country now for at least 20 years. I mean, when we went to Desert Storm in 1991, arguably the Germans had the finest forces in NATO. I mean, they were top notch, and they remained excellent through the mid 1990s. And then a series of leftist governments systematically dismantled them. This is after Chancellor Kohl left. Now, on the one hand, they took the position that Russia was not a threat, and it is not a military threat to them unless they make it so. And that was understandable, but they lost sight of the fact that if you have no skin in the game, as I said earlier, when it comes to military power, nobody's going to pay attention to you. I mean, the Polish army could invade Germany tomorrow morning and conquer it in a week.
Ooh, well, that's the line of this this interview. Colonel, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you. By the way, can I add one thing that a lot of our people don't seem to understand about these tanks?
Please.
We promised 31 M1 series tanks. They have to be built from scratch. And people have said, well, why is that? Well, it's very simple. We have a form of armor protection on the existing M1 series tanks that is some of the very best in the world, if not the best. That was developed over many years. It's a very complex composite form of armor. We will not allow tanks with that unique armor to fall into the hands of the Russians. And we have to assume, based upon the Ukrainians that have lost, we estimate 7,000 vehicles, including at least a couple of thousand tanks and 2,000 or 3,000 other armored vehicles that have either been destroyed or fell into the hands of the Russians. We have to assume that these could. So the decision was made to build 31 M1 series tanks, but apply the 1970s armor to them. So that if they fell into the hands of the opponent, it would not be a security risk for us. We would not lose this advantage. Well, right now, the Germans are providing 17 tanks, 3 from Portugal, 14 from Germany. That's not a significant number. They initially said they would end up with 88. That number continues to fall. I think for the Ukrainians, the mud would be a welcome respite.
Okay. Secretary Austin recently reinforced the Joe Biden mantra, "We'll be with you as long as it takes, and we'll get you as much ammo as you need." He's a little long-winded, but here he is.
Ukraine has been at this for a year, and so they have used a lot of artillery ammunition. We're going to do everything we can, working with our international partners, to ensure that we get them as much ammunition as quickly as possible.
As much ammunition as quickly as possible. I suppose that's so generic it could mean almost anything. But is there still enthusiasm, Colonel, as you perceive it from your sources, amongst the neocons on Capitol Hill to provide as much ammunition as possible? Or do they see the handwriting on the wall that you've been warning about for a year?
I think they see the handwriting on the wall, But having said that, it's not a question of willingness at this stage. We simply don't have much ammunition to send. We've reached the point where we're rapidly running out of ammunition in our war stocks, and our factories cannot gear up fast enough to produce more at a desired rate. We don't have a surge capacity that we had 50 years ago. It doesn't exist for missiles, rockets, anything. So I think they're going to get something more than they've gotten, but not much. And it's not going to make much difference. On the other hand, as we've talked about before, the Russians, and I just had a conversation with someone who was in Moscow a couple of days ago, who tells me that the Russian General Staff is preparing for a 30-month war against NATO and the United States. All of their munitions factories, equipment factories are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So they are well stocked and they are prepared for the worst.
Well, guess who agrees with you on the depletion of our supplies? The Secretary General of NATO, General Stoltenberg. Here he is now.
The war in Ukraine is consuming an enormous amount of ammunition and depleting Allied stockpiles. The current rate of Ukraine's ammunition expenditure is many times higher than our current rate of production. This puts our defense industries under strain.
I wish that Secretary Austin had been there. Maybe he was somewhere else in the room. But the current rate, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to think I memorized it. The current rate of Ukraine use is not twice, not three times. It's many times our ability to supply them. What does that tell you? It tells me that soon the Ukrainians will have nothing because NATO will have nothing with which to supply them. If you make $10 a day and you spend $15 a day, sooner or later, you have no cash.
Yes, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. There's no question about it. And they'll have to fall back and regroup. If they don't, they'll simply be annihilated. And that might not even work either. We'll talk about that later. But the bottom line is, yes, the situation is dire. And the more desperate things become, the more ridiculous, in some cases, the claims are made by the Ukrainians and the West.
Do you have an opinion as to why General Stoltenberg would have said that? And if he would have said that without running it past his masters in Washington first?
No, I'm sure that they asked him to say it. Everybody knows it. It's an open secret. We're in the same boat as our European allies, but I don't think anybody in Washington wanted to make that admission. So they simply said, Secretary Stoltenberg, please, emphasize this point. Again, it's a statement of desperation. Please, please, please send whatever you have. We're running out. That's not a good thing.
General Milley, who was standing right next to Secretary Austin when he made the comments that we just ran a few minutes ago, you better be sitting down, Colonel, says Russia has lost. Take a listen.
NATO and this coalition has never been stronger, and Russia is now a global pariah, and the world remains inspired by Ukrainian bravery and resilience. In short, Russia has lost. They've lost strategically, operationally, and tactically, and they are paying an enormous price on the battlefield.
Your comments, Colonel.
Well, I think he's gotten down Jake Sullivan's talking points very well. Unfortunately, none of them, equate to reality. Russia is hardly a pariah. If it were a pariah, its economy would be in ruins, and its economy is going gangbusters because everybody in the world is ready to do business with Russia except us and some of our European allies. And even there are lots of cracks in that system. Otherwise, I think whatever they tell you about the Russians, you should just turn around and apply it to the Ukrainians. They talk about no morale, no leadership, poorly trained, all this sort of business. It doesn't apply to the Russians right now. It applies to Ukrainians. It's very sad. It's a tragedy. And as you say, we've all seen this coming, but no one is willing to stand up, admit to it, and ask for talks with the Russians, sadly.
Do you see some sort of a shift going on here? I mean, these comments by General Milley were so forceful. They were literally 180 degrees from what he said 6 months ago before they slapped him on the wrist. I mean, what does he gain by saying this? I can't imagine that any serious professionals like you, or even the people, the other generals and colonels that work for him, would take seriously what he just said. And yet he said it before an international audience, and it was broadcast all over the world. That clip we just gave you was broadcast all over the world yesterday.
Well, let's be frank, Judge. This entire administration has lost a great deal of credibility in a whole range of areas over the last several months. Anything they say has to be viewed with great skepticism. General Milley has made it very clear that he is aligned with the left. He is part of this administration. He's going to say whatever they want him to say. End of discussion. Your concern about professional integrity and so forth doesn't really occur to him. He sees a different future. Remember that when these people retire, there are lots of wealthy left-wing oligarchs that will provide income for them and take care of them. The objective here is to meet that test. Please reward me for what I'm saying when I retire. That's all.
But you know him. Does he mean what he says, or is this an act intended to audition for the type of post-military retirement job he'd love to have, the one like his boss, Secretary Austin, had at Raytheon?
Well, I'd say it's the second, not the first. He's very definitely interested in the income. I don't know him personally. I have only met with him once, and I only know him by reputation, which was never very good in the Army. This is not somebody that was known for standing up and taking any tough positions under any circumstances. This was a man who was always willing to get the job done. Yes, sir. 3 bags full, as we say. So he's doing what he's done throughout his military career.
I mean, is this the type of person, is this the mentality and the character of human being, much like General Petraeus, that rises to the top in today's military?
Yes.
I mean,
definitely.
This is not Joe Biden's fault. This is culture that's been going on in the military for generations. The politicians rise, not necessarily the best generals.
Well, if you go back to the 1930s, look at the senior officers in the ranks of the French army, they were all very much like Petraeus and Milley. And of course, they failed miserably. And if you go and watch any of the documentaries, you'll have plenty of French officers that are younger, obviously, in many cases, or lower rank will come on and say, well, the politicians liked easy commanders. They wanted lapdogs, people that would go along, people that don't brook opposition. And listen, that's what we have.
Tell us what you can about the Russian onslaught that's coming. We know that President Putin is giving what's described as a major speech on the 22nd of February. That's a week from today and 2 days before the anniversary of the commencement of hostilities. Would he be prepared to say, oh, by the way, there's 250,000 troops that just crossed the border? And if he were, would we know that ahead of time from intelligence sources, that a number that of human beings that massive is in one place at one time?
Well, Judge, I thought it was the 21st. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, I'm honestly going by a writer. We get hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of messages per episode when you're on, and I'm going by what the writer has said.
Sure.
So
well, I think it's the 21st. What is happening right now is that we're seeing advances designed to effectively secure the axes of advance for the mobilized force that is being marshaled in the South. Now, what's a mobilized force? Well, we're looking at 250,000 right now of the Russian combat troops. Some of them are south and a little east of Zaporozhye when you look at the map. Others are just behind Bakhmut, which they are waiting for the Wagner military group to clean up. And then the other group is over near Liman, which is just east of Kharkov. And there, remember, we talked about 3 major concentrations, one in Western Russia, one down in the south, and one up in Belarus. The one in Belarus is sitting quietly, but is prepared, whatever comes. But these forces are going to move on at least 2, maybe 3 axes, but they're not going to move until it's completely clear. And if we look at the strikes that are going in right now, air, missile, rocket, artillery, They're stripping out all of the air defense radars and all the air defense artillery that's out there. So they want to be sure that they have a clear open field for their close air support, for their drones, for their rockets, for their missiles. Sometime in the next few days, we're going to see this gargantuan move north and west out of those three areas.
Let me just interrupt you. Gargantuan meaning with respect to the number of boots on the ground.
Yes.
Do troops literally walk miles on the ground? Or
no,
are they
almost everyone. No. Almost everyone will ride. Most of your infantry will be armored infantry, following behind armor, artillery strikes, and so forth. So no, people are not walking at all. Now, you've seen elite light infantry from the Russian side confront Ukrainians in places like Bakhmut, Ugledar, elsewhere. You're now going to see the thing change with the armored force moving forward because the terrain favors fields of fire and the kind of rolling open terrain that is good for armor. And this is perfect for the Russian way of warfare. That's what we're going to see. But it's going to be an incremental rollout. Remember, the majority of the forces the Russians are now moving forward are not bloodied. These are not people with lots of combat experience. On the contrary, many of them are fresh recruits or reservists that haven't seen much, but they are under the command of experienced combat officers. That's what counts. And thus far, they have been moved up to the line, exposed, brought back repeatedly, shifted back and forth. They've practiced their maneuvers. They're ready to go. So once these last remaining strong points on the edge of the Donbass are gone, then we'll see them move. And their goal is everything east of the Dnieper River. In other words, everything from the Russian border to Kyiv.
Right. I want to make you laugh a little because we're talking about very serious stuff. So my former colleague, because he did work at Fox for a while, and then ABC, and then CNN, and now News Nation, Chris Cuomo is over in Ukraine, and I did what I thought was an excellent report interviewing young Ukrainian either recruits or conscripts. Colonel, when I say young, I'm talking about 16 or 17 years old. In his report, he showed them doing serious military drills, and then he interviews one of them who speaks English, who tells him at his age, he has been to the front lines, he has seen blood and death, he's not afraid of it himself. Is there some age, I should know this, either internationally or legally in Ukraine, below which human beings cannot be put into battle?
Well, there should be, but there won't be, because it depends on how desperate the state is to survive. Right now, the Ukrainian state is desperate to survive. So they're going to reach down very, very low. But there are a couple of things here, Judge, that should be mentioned. Just because some of these kids may be 15, 16, 17, doesn't mean they can't be effective. In fact, there's a lot of history that suggests that they can be very lethal. We talk about our landings in Normandy, and when we faced the 2nd Waffen-SS Panzer Corps, we were complaining about all these veteran soldiers. In reality, more than 85% of the soldiers were under the age of 19. And they fought ferociously, and they inflicted 3 casualties for every one that they took.
These are German soldiers or American?
No, Germans against us and the British.
Us. Wow.
This was June of 1944 and July of 1944. Now, my point is this. Young soldiers that have never seen action are frequently much braver than those of us that have seen action, simply because we've survived some encounters. We know how lethal it is. They don't. So I believe the young man. But the sad truth of the matter is that no matter how brave you are, and no matter how much willpower you may possess, against overwhelming, accurate, devastating firepower, it's pointless.
All right,
your overwhelming, accurate, devastating firepower is what the Russians are going to bring to bear.
Your analysis is so astute, but the reason I said I was going to make you laugh is because of our person on the other side of this, Matt Van Dyke, who's physically present in Ukraine and who comes on once a week. He's the head of this group, Sons of Liberty International. They purport to be veterans, American military veterans who provide training to a non-lethal training to Ukrainian civilians and military. When I asked him about the morality of conscripting young people, he basically said it's a day in the park for them. And I got angry when he said that because I didn't believe it. But I want you to watch this clip, and then I look forward to your response. How could someone refer to a draftee in the Ukraine military as having the time of his life?
That's
This
just
is
one
death and
example.
blood and gore.
Believe me,
It's not a summer resort.
believe me, in most cases, that is not the opinion of most conscripts. But the one conscript that I know, it gave him purpose. It gave him camaraderie. He was actually pleased that he was serving his country.
Colonel, this is worse than propaganda. This is utter bullshit.
Well, in defense of Mr. Van Dyke, he said this is the one conscript that he'd spoken to. So let's be a little understanding. He spoke to one. That may well have been the attitude of one conscript. But
Right.
frankly, towards the end of the Second World War, all of the European nations that were engaged in the fighting were running out of manpower. There wasn't much enthusiasm in the last 6 months of the war to go out and be killed after just a minimum training and equipping. So I have trouble with that. The other thing is that I know that the SBU, the NKVD equivalent on the Ukrainian side, is rounding up and sending deserters back to the front, and they've got lots and lots of deserters. Many of them are very young, and they have executed some of them as an object lesson. So I think things are much worse on the Ukrainian side than obviously Van Dyke is willing to admit, and many others will.
Let's switch gears to the balloon. The balloon that captured in the American imagination and people staring in the sky for hours 2 weekends ago.
Mhm.
A person you and I know of, Gordon Chang, from time to time on Fox News, holds himself out as an expert on China, argues that the balloon flew over Malmstein Air Force Base, where approximately a third of America's land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles are stored. Then it flew near both the Warren and Minot Air Force bases, which house the remainder of America's Minuteman wings. Then it passed close to Whiteman Air Force Base, home to the nuclear-capable B-2 bomber, and then Offutt Air Force Base, headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. Quote, this path suggests China is gathering intelligence for either a first or second strike on America's nukes, close quote. Should we believe this stuff?
The short answer is no. First of all, you don't steer balloons. I'm sorry, but it's very difficult. Once you launch the thing into the atmosphere, the predominant winds have a bad habit of moving it wherever it wants to go. Secondly, I talked to someone at the U.S. Weather Service, and they told me that the path taken by it was roughly equivalent to where the jet stream goes across North America. That it went over those areas is probably not necessarily deliberate. It simply worked out that way. And again, assuming this thing was collecting intelligence, I have great doubts about that. I'm prepared to believe in many things, but I don't think it can collect much. They have 300 satellites, 100 of which are military. There's no shortage of opportunity for the Chinese to find out anything they want without relying on something like a balloon. And then we haven't even talked about something mentioned in USA Today, which is about the thousands of Chinese in our university and corporate laboratories, the thousands of Chinese who come here illegally to the southern border. We've had 5 million illegals enter the country since President Biden took over. All of that is infinitely more important. So no, I don't think so. And I think he's discarding the reality that the Chinese were the first to adopt a no first use. And they mean it. And if you look at the structure of their nuclear arsenal, they are not postured to deliver a decisive first strike. They're postured to deliver a certain second strike.
General Stoltenberg said that he thought the balloon was a joint Russia-Chinese operation. Do you know, or have you heard any evidence of that other than Stoltenberg's opinion?
No. I think anything that you hear at this point about these balloons is you should be skeptical. And that is probably the funniest one I've heard yet. Let's spread the blame for the evil balloon around and insist the Russians had a hand in it. Again, the Russians have more satellites than the Chinese. It's just crazy nonsense.
Okay. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, when it happened, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Deputy Secretary of State, I'm not certain of her title, Victoria Nuland, we know who she is, we know what she's done in the past, all said the Russians did it. President Putin truthfully said, what are you, crazy? Why would we do that to our own industry? The Americans did it. Cy Hirsch, he of Watergate, CIA spying, domestic spying, My Lai massacre, Pulitzer Prize fame, probably the best, all right, Bob Woodward, don't get mad at me, the best investigative reporter in the United States, comes up with a lengthy piece with 3 sources, that's his reputation for every allegation in there, demonstrating President Biden ordered explosives put down there in June and the explosives detonated in September. He had the explosives put there by Navy SEALs, military, planned by CIA intelligence, triggered by CIA intelligence, so he can claim it was intelligence and not military. Have you ever heard of an American president using intelligence and military resources to attack an ally, Germany?
That's a good question. I have not heard of that. It's the first time that we've done that, I guess, and that's very unfortunate because Germany didn't deserve it. I'm not sure it should have happened one way or the other. It was effectively an act of war, in my judgment, under international law.
Yes, Colonel, it might have been a war crime because they attacked a non-military target for a non-military purpose.
Well, that's true. We haven't been very good historically in tracking those things and holding anybody accountable for them, but I'm sure you're probably right. The bottom line is Cy Hirsch is many things, but he's an honest man. He makes honest mistakes like we all do from time to time. But I think his track record is excellent. And this particular incident, everything he describes is plausible. Because if you'd have moved this through Special Operations Command, it would have been very difficult to keep this concealed from Congress. Not that Congress has stood up lately and made any difference, but nevertheless, that's true. So he went, apparently CIA, Department of the Navy. That certainly makes sense to me. I just regret the whole thing. I think it was totally unnecessary. It makes it harder to end the conflict. And again, whenever you make the decision, as we have, to precipitate this war, and people need to understand that long before this thing began with Russians intervening in Ukraine, 14,000 people were killed since 2014 in those 2 Russian autonomous republics. And that was one of the points that Putin wanted to put an end to, the violence against Russian citizens living in Ukraine. Long before that happened, we refused to honor anything that the Russians wanted, said, or thought, or did. We treated it all with complete contempt. This particular action makes it much, much harder to end the war. When you go into something like this, you should always think about, how do I end it? How do we put an end to this? The notion that we should fight every war to the point where there are no enemy left or everyone is annihilated, which is a mistake we made in 1945, is ridiculous. That's not what we should do. We are, in theory, a liberal democratic republic. That should be the least of our aims, but it seems that way. And if you're sitting in Moscow right now, you say to yourself, well, we can't depend on anything anybody says. We have to prepare for a long war. So the order comes down. We may have to fight for 30 months before this is over, because we're not simply dealing with Ukraine and Ukrainian forces. We're up against the United States and NATO. And of course, if they're looking at 30 months, how long can that drag on before some serious mistake is made and we find ourselves in direct combat with Russia?
Are you hearing anything, any fear in Washington of Biden and others being accused of war crimes over the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline?
No, in fact, they laugh at the prospect.
Mm.
What
about
thinks they're immune?
You have been very critical, and rightly so, of Chancellor Scholz. I'm sure that he was in the dark. There's no way he could have known about this ahead of time. If so, he's committed under German law an impeachable offense. They humiliated him. I mean, Cy Chase humiliated him. You learn from a reporter that your ally destroyed an asset that your biggest utility company built and on which half of your population relies to heat their homes in the winter, and you say nothing publicly.
Well, the problem here is that the German population itself has grown complacent and comfortable after many.
Today's guest is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a distinguished military strategist, decorated combat veteran, and seasoned commentator. With a wealth of experience in the U.S. Army, Colonel Macgregor has served our nation with distinction, earning numerous awards for his leadership and bravery. He's one of the most sought-after military minds for discussing the Russia-Ukraine war and other U.S. military interactions. Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure, happy to be with you, Steve.
So right out of the gates, I want to get something that has me confused, because this is a gentleman that seems like he should have more commentary in alignment with your thinking, but he seems to fall in line with the CNN generals. But this is General Ben Hodge says, if
Hodges.
NATO
Hodges, yeah.
Hodges, if NATO doesn't ramp up production and military bodies, Vladimir Putin will attack, not because he is provoked by NATO, but because he sees NATO as unprepared. Is there any truth to what he's saying, or is this just fear-mongering?
I think we can say with total certainty that nothing that comes out of General Hodges' mouth is informed or truthful. He was the former commander as a 3-star of the small force still left in Germany at the end of the Cold War. And he saddled up with people that are paying him handsomely for plugging the war with Russia, the proxy war. And he's, as a result, incurably anti-Russian. And he's also ridiculously optimistic. I mean, he's been talking about with a few more missiles and a few more tanks, the Ukrainians are going to retake Crimea and roll forward into Russia. This has been going on for months and months and months. He's never come to terms with reality. And of course, he has no interest in doing so. It's not going to pay him any money.
Yeah. Well, based on who was having him on his show, I figured he was probably being paid $5,000 to $10,000 a month to say Ukraine is going to win, U.S. taxpayer money is justified, Putin is weaker than we think, and they will take back territory. I understand where he's coming from, where, you know, if the U.S. military or another country doesn't look prepared and an enemy wanted to attack, they would have justification. But this idea that Vladimir Putin wants to roll in and take over Berlin and Paris and other areas of Europe seems ridiculous to me. What are your thoughts?
A couple of years ago, every time someone talked about the fighting in Ukraine, the same cast of characters, retired generals, both UK and US, as well as the sort of status quo swamp creatures in Washington, kept telling the American people, oh, the Russians are incompetent. They can't get anything right. The Russians are losing. I mean, I don't know how many senior political figures that spoke to me within a month or 6 weeks of the war's beginning and said, well, what do you think? I said, well, this is a catastrophe. We need to stop this war immediately. And they said, really? I said, absolutely. They said, well, the Ukrainians are winning. I said, no, they're not. This it hasn't really even gotten off the ground yet. I said, you know, if we don't stop this, they'll be destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians will die for nothing. People were absolutely stunned because the Western media was all preaching the same line of nonsense. So that's never really changed. And even now, after we had the prosecutor general of Ukraine, who went on Ukrainian television on the 7th of January and told the population, we've lost 500,000 dead soldiers, Ukrainians. Well, I've been saying that for some time, and everybody's, oh, that's impossible.
Oh, no, that's the Russians. No, the Russians have lost far, far fewer. I would say the exchange ratio is probably about 1-7 and going up. And we have given the Ukrainians terrible advice, and we flooded them with a lot of equipment that they couldn't possibly employ effectively without years of experience. We tried to build an army on the fly. So today, Ukraine is in ruins. The graveyards are full, and they continue to fill up. Now Russians are capturing men in their 70s and boys 14 and 15 in uniform. They have to send out press gangs to force people into the Ukrainian military. People in Western Ukraine are horrified now. They don't want to be dragged into this, even though they all universally detest Russians, but they don't want to fight in this war. If the truth were printed or stated publicly, we'd have a much clearer picture of Zelensky as a complete and utter fraud, someone who doesn't represent the interests of Ukraine at all. And he's busy running around trying to sell out his country to BlackRock and its subsidiaries, Monsanto and others, with this rich farmland, and looking forward, I guess, to a comfortable retirement in one of his villas in Italy or Cyprus or somewhere else, or probably in Florida at some point. This whole thing is a scam, and the Ukrainians have been exploited mercilessly by us. And then you hear people say, like our friend Senator Lindsey Graham, oh, we should be so grateful. No Americans have really died. Well, we know somewhere between 450 and 500 Americans, whether they were in uniform or not, or contractors, they've died in Ukraine. But again, the administration isn't going to let anybody know that. It's not going to be published, but it's true. I don't know the exact figure, but that's roughly accurate based on my sources in Eastern Europe. And he's saying, well, the Russians are being harmed, and we're doing this at bargain basement prices. I mean, just imagine that. We've exploited these people to do something we think benefits us. It doesn't. And the truth is that Russia economically is stronger and healthier now than it was 2 years ago, infinitely more. And Russia is now leading a substantial portion of the world in the direction of the gold standard, which would put an end to us, frankly, because we're the money printing center of the world. And once you go to a gold standard, that falls apart. And at the same time, the Russians have built a magnificent army and a much improved air force, and their submarine fleet is in excellent shape. Their surface fleet's not so much, but frankly, Russia doesn't need much of a surface fleet, to be blunt. So at the end of the day, we look ridiculous. Our armed forces are in terrible shape. And a lot of the equipment that went over there wasn't used properly. And so most people have concluded that our equipment and technology is third rate. So if anything, what we've done is present a picture to the whole world of extreme weakness, as well as ruthless selfishness, deceit, and greed, because we've made lots of money from the war. When I say we, I'm talking about the famous military-industrial congressional complex, which is why they still want to send money there, because they know the money isn't going to do much for Ukraine or the equipment, but the profits will all go into people's pockets here. Yeah. So it's all the way around a terrible, disgraceful fraud, and I'm sure it's one of these things that you'll turn on PBS and there'll be a frontline documentary in 5 or 6 years and tell us all about the tragedy. But in the meantime, all the people that are even making that sort of thing are all signed on for this tragic war, and people are still dying. And there's nobody left in Ukraine. I should say nobody, but millions have left that country, and they will never go back.
Yeah.
So the country itself is in serious trouble.
Yeah. I like how Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said to the American people, specifically Republicans, that he can't keep on board. Don't worry, we're not sending your money to Ukraine. We're sending it to American contractor companies. Like you just told us how this is a giant money laundering scheme back to your donors.
Exactly. But, he's part of the proverbial swamp, and that's why most of us have figured out, and the organization that I'm now the CEO for, Our Country, Our Choice, most of our members have figured out that there's not much difference between the Republicans or Democrats in Washington. No matter who you vote for, you get the same policy outcome. So you've got a bipartisan uniparty that is doing exactly what you described, Stephen. Absolutely. I hope every American understands this. I don't think they do, but I wish they would.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Okay, Volodymyr Zelensky has asked the country of Switzerland to host peace talks for Ukraine. However, they've specifically said no one from Russia is allowed to attend these peace talks. So why pick Switzerland, and why not invite an envoy or a diplomat from Russia if you really want this thing to end?
Well, initially, I was delighted when that report came through because I thought this, thank God, this is going to end. And I was surprised, and justifiably so, that Zelensky, who is probably one of the most criminal characters that's ever risen to power in Europe, perhaps the most criminal in many respects and corrupt Stalin. But, having said that, it didn't turn out to be the case, as you point out. And it simply is turning into another pass the hat around and throw money in it for what he calls reparations. Reparations being, oh, we're going to rebuild Ukraine. It's back to the same scam I was describing earlier that involves BlackRock and Larry Fink and the rest of these characters. That's very tragic, but I'm sure the Senate is delighted, and I know Mitch McConnell is because he's got his hands in all of that, and he's undoubtedly going to profit as well as most of his colleagues. So I guess the whole thing is a scam. Now, Switzerland's in trouble, Stephen, and Americans are not aware of this because the Swiss decided to cast their lot for the first time in centuries with a crazy EU and with NATO, effectively, because what they've said is, oh, Russians are evil, Russians are bad, let's all support Zelensky. So Switzerland is no longer taken seriously as a neutral state, which was a terrible, terrible loss to the world because Switzerland is a place where everyone who hated each other could come and sort out differences because Switzerland was genuinely neutral. It is not anymore. So even if they invited the Russians at this point, I don't think the Russians would show up. Same tragedy of losing Finland as a neutral state and Sweden. Those were places where warring parties could meet and sort things out. They are no longer. So I think the Russians would probably balk at that notion anyway. And frankly, why should they bother paying any attention to Zelensky or us? They've won the war. Everybody's like, well, they're still fighting. Well, if you're sending 70-year-olds and 15-year-olds into action, pregnant women, I'm told, have even shown up out there. Are you winning? I don't think so. And the Russians are gradually advancing all across the front. I think they're going to continue to advance. And then at some point, when they decide to do so, they will go right to the Dnieper River. Then the question they've got to ask is, how much further do we go? And they don't want to go much further, to be frank, because the last thing that the people in Moscow want to do is rule Ukrainians. Why would they want to do that? They don't want to rule anybody who's not a Russian. That's a lot of trouble. They went through that after the Second World War. The Warsaw Pact was not some sort of great boon for the Soviets. It became one shortly after the war, while they could exploit it and strip it of resources and technology, particularly the eastern parts of Germany that now reside in Poland and what was formerly East Germany. But they couldn't do it very long. And eventually it became a burden. Cuba's another example. Cuba was a huge money pit, just a drain on the Soviet economy, as frankly, so is Puerto Rico to us. I don't know why anybody opposes independence for Puerto Rico. I think they should have it and go away. But, we're stupid and we continue to hold on to these places. And the Russians finally figured out this is a waste and got out. And that was the right thing to do. They're not going to go back and repeat that. They really want to do business with the West. And they're nicely positioned to do business because they're going to be the sort of middleman, or one of the key middlemen, in Central Asia between China and the West. So why would they want a war? The Chinese don't want a war because war is bad for business. I know everybody finds that hard to believe in America, but truthfully, war is not good for business. It destroys your standard of living. It destroys your currency. We can go on and on and on. So I hope that at some point people will figure out that what Zelensky's all about, and then we can put this to bed. But it's not going to happen quickly.
Yeah, this thing in Switzerland kind of reminds me of like these MLM pyramid scheme companies where it's like a friend invites you over to show something that could be life-changing, and then next thing they're trying to get money out of you, right? Like, so at first I was like, why wouldn't he want somebody from Russia, a diplomat or Lavrov or somebody to come? But like you say, it's just to get people focus back on Ukraine, raise more money, get things going for BlackRock. Man, what a shame. I wanted to, I don't know, I'm sure you saw this, but the German Ministry of Defense has leaked a document showing an 18-month timeline, a predicted chronological timeline of how Vladimir Putin is going to take over Europe, where he's going to start different battles. Is this just a complete hypothetical that they're now using to scare Europeans and keep milking money out of them? Or is there any truth to this 18-month timeline?
Well, first of all, there's nothing hypothetical about it. It's a sham. It's an attempt to try and justify what's been going on in Ukraine and keep it going on the assumption that people will look at this map, which is absurd, and begin to fear, the imminent arrival of the Russians, which is, they're not coming. And somehow or another, this will keep people like Scholz and Macron and others, globalists, in power. I mean, when you have nothing left, what do you do? Because right now, Scholz is about as popular as the plague in Germany. And the problem is that the Germans haven't been able to figure out who they're going to put in there to replace him. There are no, well, there may be in the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, there may be some stars in that group. You have the old communist Wagenknecht. She's a very, very intelligent and persuasive woman. But, there's nobody there that you can point to the way you could have said 30 or 40 years ago, well, there's Helmut Schmidt, he's a future chancellor, or Helmut Kohl, he's a future chancellor. There's nobody that you can point to right now with certainty. So the Germans are sort of like a beached whale that is slowly dying. It's gotten into shallow water. It's deindustrialized itself. It's basically destroying itself. And it's infested with foreigners that have come into the country that the Germans don't want any more than the Scandinavians do. So the globalists have successfully destroyed Europe. Some people think it's dead forever. I don't agree with that, but it's going to be tough to cure it. But that's the problem. So you haul out these ridiculous things and say, oh, the Russians are coming. So see, you don't have any choice. You have to do what we say. If you look at that map, and I have, you could dust off the old Cold War discussions and plans and come up with something similar back in the 1970s or 80s. But in that period, it was real. There were real potentials for that sort of thing. This, absolutely not. This is just nonsense. And hopefully the Germans will treat it with the complete contempt that it deserves. But who knows? Too many people in our country, too many people in Western Europe and Poland and places like that continue to impute some degree of legitimacy and I would say honesty to their media. They should not. They just shouldn't. We're not hearing the truth through the regular media. I mean, I don't know what your listeners think, but if I really want to know something about anything in the world, I get on the internet and I start digging and going through and looking for alternative views and sources, many of which are very, very good, but will never find their way into the mainstream for the reasons that we're discussing. The mainstream media, like the financial sector, as well as our government, all in the hands of the same people who are trying to keep all of these things going and maintain a facade that somehow or another this is good for us. We all know it's not, but there's still too many people that want to believe. You know, that comment that you used to hear on the X-Files, I want to believe, in UFOs or something. Well, that's the problem. We got to stop it. It's not true.
Yeah. Okay. You've mentioned BlackRock a couple of times. Presidential candidate RFK Jr. said in a speech, BlackRock and others already own Ukraine. It's been decided the real money will be made on this war when they rebuild Ukraine. So are these companies going to get to profit billions or possibly trillions of dollars off of American taxpayer money?
Well, I think that's the plan. And I think that Tony Blinken and his colleagues, as well as Larry Fink and, Zelensky, all of them are in bed together. They're all members of the same, class of people, and they all want to stuff their pockets full of cash. So unless somebody intervenes and stops it, I would say yes. And I feel terrible for the Ukrainians. I grew up with them. And they've been lied to from day one by this government, and they exploited Ukrainian nationalism, courage, and valor to destroy the country. So no, I'm afraid RFK Jr. is right, and he's probably the only one who has both identified who these criminals are that are going to destroy what remains of Ukraine, but also has told the truth about all of it. And I'm very grateful for it. I wish I would hear that from more candidates, but we're not hearing it.
Yeah. Okay. Give my audience a summary of what's going on near the Red Sea with the Houthis. All of a sudden, I'm hearing a lot about Iran, but then Yemen and the Houthis, and they're attacking, and the U.S. military is counterattacking. Give us just a rundown of this. What's going on in this situation?
Well, first, all of your viewers should stop for a second, pause, and remember that certainly over the last 30 years, lots of people have been talking about bombing Iran. I mean, I remember when I was on active duty listening to John McCain sort of repeat this old song about Baba Baran, Barbaran, and then he would say bomb, 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 bomb in Iran. This has been going on forever. And the neocon globalist cabal has been trying desperately to bring a war on with Iran. Now, remember that what stood between war with Iran and reason, rationality, and peace the last time around in 2019 was Donald Trump. He said no. And what had happened was a global hawk had flown right along the edge of what we call the Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. And that was deliberate by the CENTCOM commander, then General McKenzie. And he was working with John Bolton and Secretary of State Pompeo. And they all thought this was brilliant because they knew that it was better than a 50% chance that the Iranians would shoot down this global hawk, which, by the way, under international law, if you fly into the or on the edge of the air defense identification zone of any country and you don't alert that country that you're doing so with a military aircraft, then they have the right to shoot it down. And it specifically talks about in law, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, which is exactly what the global hawk is about. So the Iranians watched and watched and watched, and finally they said, well, I guess we shoot it down, and they did. Well, this was greeted with tremendous joy inside the Beltway, especially by the usual suspects. Oh, this is great. Now we have what we need. We can attack Iran. I mean, you've listened to General Keane on television. He's another one. All of these people are profiting from this. In other words, they're part of a cabal that rewards its supporters handsomely financially. And what they all said was, now we have what we need and let's go to war. And they brought the vans with all sorts of expensive technology over to the White House so that you could turn the White House into an immediate sort of war headquarters. They all descended upon President Trump in the Oval Office, and he asked a couple of important questions. One of the questions was, how many people are we going to kill if we do what you want? Because they already had the strike package with aircraft and missiles ready to go. And the answer was, well, perhaps 300, maybe 500. And he said, how many people did we lose as a result of Global Hawk? I said, well, it's unmanned, nobody. Then he said, well, after the strikes go in, then what? Well, the answer is, well, we have a war. And why? What's the point? What do we gain from this? And he said, no, thanks very much for all the information, appreciate it, but no, we are not going to respond to this with a massive strike package. So suddenly all the big donors like Adelson and the others who have been pressing hard, we must have a war. This is good for the United States. This is good for Israel. Iran has to be destroyed. Everybody was sad-faced, unhappy face, and everybody sort of, oh, this is terrible, and walked away from the White House. Donald Trump saved us from a calamity. Well, we're back in the same position again. This time, the Houthis. Who are the Houthis? The Houthis are Shiite Arab tribesmen that have finally become the major force in this place called Yemen, down at the bottom of the Saudi peninsula, the Arab peninsula. But they've been fighting for many years, at least up until 2016, for their lives and their survival against the Saudis and, guess what? Al-Qaeda, because Saudi Arabia enlisted Al-Qaeda fighters to fight on the ground for them, while the Saudis and we bombed the Houthis. Why? Well, they're Shiites. And the Shiites didn't know what to do. They went to Iran and asked for help because they were the only people out there that would provide the Houthis with any assistance. They got it. And so obviously they were at that point an arm of the Iranian octopus. And so eventually the war ended in a stalemate. The Houthis were actually the ones that prevailed. Even in the United States, the terrible famine that was brought on by all of this had killed tens of thousands of people. Finally, in Washington, we said, oh my God, this needs to stop. We told the Saudis no more, we won't support it. So it ended. Well, now the Houthis have decided that they are Arabs. So are the people that we call Hezbollah. They may be Shiites, but they're also Arabs. The so-called Shiite militias in Iraq that are all, quote unquote, Iranian backed, which is the effort to try and convey the impression that Iran controls everything these people do. They're Arabs. The people in Hamas who are being killed in great numbers are Arabs. We're up to what, 23,000 dead now. And so the Houthis have said, we are demonstrating our solidarity to our Arab brothers who are being murdered in Gaza. And until the efforts against them stop, we're going to make it miserable for commercial traffic through the Red Sea. Now, bear in mind, these are now much more sophisticated people than the ones they were a few years ago. They actually know who registers the ship, who's an owner or a part owner. And all of the ships that they've attacked, I think with maybe one exception, have had either real complete ownership or partial ownership by Israelis. And so they said, if you're a part owner or you own, because remember, the thing is flagged. It may be a Panamanian ship that flies some other flag, but it doesn't tell you who owns it, who's profiting from moving oil, liquefied natural gas, food, whatever. They've been able to find out. And it doesn't take much to stop commercial traffic. They don't have the newest and most lethal weaponry. They're using weaponry that's old, but it's still potentially lethal. And they've had some success in damaging ships. They haven't sunk anything. But if you're an insurer sitting in London, like Lloyd's, you're not going to insure any ships that go through the Red Sea until this is gone. And we have been pushed and pushed and pushed to, well, you've got to go down there and do something. I mean, the Israelis want us to do something because the Israelis can't use their port of Aqaba. They can't get through the Gulf of Aqaba or down where the port of Eilat is. They can't move anything up through the Suez Canal and then around in the Eastern Mediterranean to Israeli ports. So the Israelis said, you've got to do something. So after much gnashing of teeth and so forth, we did. Now, keep in mind that the Houthis were prepared and they were actually informed before the strikes went in. So I'm not sure we did much damage. And friends of mine who are on the inside that looked at the target set told me that we were hitting targets that we hit back in 2015 and 2014. In other words, these aren't new things that we haven't struck in the past. So I don't think it had much effect, but I think it probably made Mr. Netanyahu very happy, and it made people on the Hill happy because, in theory, this could lead to war with Iran, which is the real goal. We've got to go to war with Iran. Iran is the enemy. So I don't think it's had much impact on the Houthis. I don't think the Houthis are about to surrender and go away. I hope we don't try to land soldiers or Marines to chase them through the mountains down there. The terrain is terrible. It's a rotten place to fight anybody. The British were down there in Aden years ago in the 60s, and they finally said, to hell with this, and went home. I hope we don't bother with that. I wish we would talk to them and see whether or not we could come to some sort of arrangement. We know what their demand is, which is to stop what's happening in Gaza. We understand that, but maybe there's some room for discussion. We have this bad habit of sanctioning and bombing everyone who doesn't agree with us. It hasn't worked, and it's not going to work with the Houthis. But the real danger, as we started this, and I apologize for the long diatribe, the real problem with this is it's really about Iran. And we don't understand that all of that oil infrastructure up and down the Persian Gulf and into Saudi Arabia, it's all very fragile. It wouldn't take much to damage any of it. And that has huge implications for us and for the world economically.
Yeah, well, it was Senator Lindsey Graham who said that we should bomb every one of Iran's oil fields over the Israel attack. I mean, that would have had global repercussions that we can't even imagine. And yet he was willing to do it at the snap of a finger, thank goodness he doesn't control the nuclear buttons, you know? Oh, gosh.
Well, he's the combat lawyer, remember? His great claim to fame is he's a veteran.
Yeah, he's a
And
JAG lawyer.
Afghanistan, and he was in Iraq. And what did he do? Well, he was an attorney in the forward operating base. You know, that's like saying I led the Boy Scout troop, you know, along the border with Mexico.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great example. You know, when you were telling that that setup of Iran and that unmanned aircraft to be shot down, I couldn't help but think of how the military and the CIA were trying to trick JFK with a fake airplane being shot up by Cuba in order to justify. I mean, it's almost like they were trying to set Donald Trump, you know, trip him into a war. But he saw through it and asked questions just like JFK did. Now,
Well, the other thing is we got to give President Trump credit for something. And look, I have a lot of affection for him. I like him, but he has good instincts, and he listens to them. And his instincts said the American people don't want a war. A war is not good for anybody. A war will not help this country. A war will not help anyone who lives in the Middle East. So I'm not going to do it. Thank God. You know, I don't see any evidence for any sort of instinct with this man Biden, or for that matter, most of the rest of the candidates. I think RFK Jr. would be inclined to say no too, but the rest of them, forget it.
Yeah, yeah. Why did Biden unlabel or remove the Houthis as a terrorist group in 2021? Had something changed? Because now this morning I read he's definitely putting them back on the terrorist watch list. I guess I don't understand it.
Neither do I really, and I'm not familiar with the reasoning behind it. I'm sure there are people out there that can tell you whatever the rationale was, but the point is it didn't last long, and they're back on the hit list. And that's the way that's where they're gonna stay. Pretty soon, everybody in the Middle East is going to be on that list.
Yeah. Okay, final question. I appreciate you coming on. You brought up Donald Trump. He has just barnstormed Iowa. He won by a number bigger than any Republican in the party's history. That doesn't mean anything other than he's got one state. We'll see if it's a pattern in New Hampshire. But how might Donald Trump react to with presidential power, react to the crisis at the southern border? Because as of yesterday, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said he wants a bill that allows 5,000 illegal immigrants into the country 365 days a year, immediate work visas, a place to live, food, cell phone, lawyers. Just bring them in and push them on the path of citizenship from hour one. How would this president behave differently than the current administration?
I cannot imagine Donald Trump ever signing on for any such thing. He knows what's happening. Schumer is out to destroy us, people like you and me. That we are the problem. We are the Americans who stand in the way of our denationalization. The left wants to convert us, and the left is not alone because they have fellow travelers on the right. I think if you look carefully at the announcement that came out last night, Senator Langford from Oklahoma, a supposed Republican, he's somebody we would call a rhino, decided, oh, sure, I'll sign on for this with Schumer, and this will solve everything. Just as amnesty that was finally approved by Reagan back in the 80s solved everything. Yeah, sure. As soon as he approved amnesty, that's when illegal immigration took off on a scale that had never been seen before in the history of the country. And we've been dealing with the consequences ever since. The point is that the more people you can bring into the United States who are fundamentally different from us, who do not share our values, our interests, they have no interest in the United States. They don't want to be Americans. A friend of mine who's from El Salvador sent me a note last night and said about this whole situation. And he said, you know, it took me 6 years to become a citizen. And he said, I'm very proud of being a citizen. He said, then I ran into people from what was it, MI 14 or 15? I can't remember the gangs out of El Salvador.
Yes, the MS-13.
MS-13, that's right. He said, I ran into some people who were in MS-13 who had just run in, and I guess they joined the Marine Corps because that was a path to citizenship. They could stay here permanently. do their time, learn some useful skills, and then get out and continue their criminal activities. This is a catastrophe for us, and Schumer knows it. He wants it. Langford may or may not know it. I think he's just responding to donors. Who knows how much money is being spread around into various PACs on the promise that if you go ahead with us and help us to ruin America, turn it into some extension of the unwashed developing world, so that our republic dies and everything that we associate with being an American is vanished, then you can have all this money. I mean, I think it's what it boils down to. I have less and less confidence that there are very many people holding high office in this country who really care about us anymore.
Yeah, seems to be an insider's game for how to win in the stock market while pretending to care about the American people. Oh, man. Well, Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on, keeping us in the loop on the Russia-Ukraine situation, the continued war propaganda and fear-mongering to scare America. I read just this morning that like people in Sweden are so afraid that Putin is going to attack that their mental health crisis phone lines are like hours long waiting. They've scared their people so much that they're literally, these rumors of war are giving them panic attacks. It's just sad.
Look, the Swedes and Finns, the population in those countries were very alarmed by the sudden arrival of U.S. troops and equipment and technology up near the Arctic Circle. Obviously, we wanted access to bases there, and we're rushing up there ostensibly for the purpose of threatening Russia. This is very dangerous because the Russians present no threat. But if we continue to try and encircle and threaten Russia, God knows what happens if we try to put missiles and radars up there. All sorts of terrible things could happen in the future, but they will be things that we provoked and precipitated. The Swedes and the Finns are, as a group, I would characterize them as sheeple. They believe whatever they're told by their governments. I've been to Sweden many times, and I always loved the place, enjoyed the people, but one of the problems I had with them is that they would always respond to a question, why do you do this, X, Y, and Z? And the Swedes would say, well, the government has made a study and determined that it is good for you. And I, as an American, I said, you know, why the hell would you trust your government? I don't trust mine. And I don't believe in unconditionally supporting anybody anywhere for any reason. I want to know why. I thought that's a big part of being an American. That's what distinguished us. Everybody that came here said, we've had it with the old regime. You know, we want to have a say in what happens. And if you start doing things to us, we're going to say, why? I don't hear very many whys.
Yeah, if President Reagan tried his famous joke there, it wouldn't land. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. They'd be, oh, come on in, come on in, sit on my furniture. So, well, hey, thank you so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it. Your military insight is invaluable, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Stephen.